Okay, so we resume the journey with The Tale of Two Cities, Book the First, Chapter 4, titled The Preparation. And as you know, titles are important, or at least relevant, in this book. So, preparation. I ask you, preparation for what? We just left off Chapter 3 with Mr. Lorry riding in the mail coach, waking up from that pseudo-nightmare where he was on his way to dig someone out of a grave. Preparation starts with his exiting the mail coach that morning. When the mail got successfully to Dover in the course of the forenoon, the head drawer at the Royal George Hotel opened the coach door, as his custom was. He did it with some flourish of ceremony, for a mail journey from London in winter was an achievement to congratulate an adventurous traveler upon. So, he gets to his hotel, Royal George Hotel, and the head drawer, which is essentially what we would consider a bartender now. It's the guy who draws the beer. They also had other functions back then, like they may be your waiter or kind of show you into the place, things like that. And he opens that door for Mr. Lorry with a big flourish, like a super over-the-top gesture, right? Like, come out, magnificent sir. Because apparently a journey from London all the way to Dover, that trip was a big deal. I mean, it's 76, roughly, miles. So, today it would take us like 2 hours. Back then, good lord, it would take forever, right? So, lots of flourish. By that time, there was only one adventurous traveler left to be congratulated, for the two others had been set down at their respective roadside destinations. The mildewy inside of the coach, with its damp and dirty straw, its disagreeable smell, and its obscurity, was rather like a larger dog kennel. Mr. Lorry, the passenger shaking himself out of its chains of straw, a tangle of shaggy wrapper, flapping hat, and muddy legs, was rather like a larger sort of dog. So there's this kind of funny simile. Mr. Lorry hops out of this kind of disgusting at this point coach and like shakes himself. Just imagine how a dog shakes himself when he's getting, like the water out of his hair or something like that. Just that's what Mr. Lorry looks like when he hops out of the coach. There will be a packet to Calais tomorrow, drawer. Yes, sir, if the weather holds and the wind sets tolerable fair. The tide will serve pretty nicely at about 2 in the afternoon, sir. Bed, sir? That's the drawer talking, obviously. I shall not go to bed till tonight, but I want a bedroom and a barber. And then breakfast, sir. Yes, sir, that way, sir, if you please. Show Concord. Gentlemen's valet in hot water to Concord. Pull off gentlemen's boots in Concord. You will find a fine sea-coal fire, sir. Fetch barber to Concord. Stir about there now for Concord. Okay, so all of that, if you didn't understand, was the head drawer yelling at the other workers of the hotel to, like, get busy, get moving, get to this place, Concord. Concord is the name of a room in that hotel, because like the really fancy hotels, even today, have like certain names attached to them. It's not just this room, it's the name of the room. And when he says a fine sea coal fire, that's to talk about like it's a super nice fire. It's not just a charcoal fire. Charcoal was a lot cheaper way back then, but it was also known to have some adverse health effects if you lit it into small of a room. So a fine sea coal fire is a really, really nice one. The Concord bedchamber, being always assigned to the passenger by the mail, and passengers by the mail being always heavily wrapped up from head to foot, the room had the odd interest for the establishment of the Royal George, that although but one kind of man was seen going into it, all kinds and varieties of men came out. Consequently, another drawer, 2 porters, and several maids of the landlady were all loitering by accident at various points of the road between the Concord and the coffee room, when a gentleman of 60, formally dressed in a brown suit of clothes, pretty well worn, but well kept, with large square cuffs and large flaps to the pockets, passed along on his way to his breakfast. Okay, those servants are not just like randomly standing there. I know he says that, but Dickens points out, and like we know from the mail, everybody looks exactly the same, right? They're wrapped from head to toe. Lorry could have been any one of those 3 passengers. They all look alike, etc. So one kind of man goes into that room. Then they get cleaned up. and who knows what comes out. It's like opening a Christmas present. It's a surprise. So they're all just kind of standing around being nosy, like, ooh, what's the new guy look like? The coffee room had no other occupant that forenoon than the gentleman in brown. His breakfast table was drawn before the fire, and as he sat, with its light shining on him, waiting for the meal, he sat so still that he might have been sitting for his portrait. Very orderly and methodical he looked, with a hand on each knee and a loud watch ticking a sonorous sermon under his flapped waistcoat, as though it pitted its gravity and longevity against the levity and evanescence of the brisk fire. He had a good leg, and was a little vain of it, for his brown stockings fitted sleek and close, and were of a fine texture. His shoes and buckles, too, though plain, were trim. He wore an odd little sleek, crisp, flaxen wig, setting very closely to his head, which wig, it is to be presumed, was made of hair, but which looked far more as though were spun from filaments of silk or glass. His linen, though not of a fineness in accordance with his stockings, was as white as the tops of the waves that broke upon the neighboring beach, or the specks of sail that glinted in the sunlight far at sea. A face habitually suppressed and quieted was still lighted up under the quaint wig by a pair of moist, bright eyes that must have cost their owner, in years gone by, some pains to drill to the composed and reserved expression of Tellson's Bank. He had a healthy color in his cheeks, and his face, though lined, bore few traces of anxiety. But perhaps the confidential bachelor clerks in Tellson's Bank were principally occupied with the cares of other people, and perhaps second-hand cares, like second-hand clothes, come easily off and on. Okay, so you get this description of Mr. Lorry for the first time, like brown is his color, because it just completely symbolizes the kind of guy he is. He's very plain, very businesslike, very methodical, very well kept, but a little boring, if you will. His clothing, because there's no way you probably know this unless you're just like a history nut, it was outdated for the time period he's wearing it. Okay, so 1775. I mean, buckles were still in fashion. They don't turn into like shoelaces like what we think of until French Revolution-y time period. But the small little wigs when Laurie would have been sitting there would have been like big and over the top and like gaudy, whereas he's wearing this little one, so it's an older style. And even the way his clothes are described, I mean, they're very clean, they're very orderly, but they're worn. So he adheres to a time period that is slightly older and maybe slightly more modest than the one that he's about to step into, right? Oh, and the good leg part, that just means he has, sexy legs. Woo! And he's a little vain of them. The bright eyes and, like, drilling them into composure. Tellson's, which you'll see in a chapter later when it goes on and on about this description of the bank, is exceptionally old-fashioned, which fits Laurie's description as well, right? It's very old-fashioned. And they don't believe in levity and lightness and, I don't know, the laughter of children. And so even though Laurie has that kind of face where you could tell he's a happy person on the inside, and he was probably real like bright-eyed and festive as a younger man, it took him great pains to like drill himself into that composure and that like lack of levity he has now. But it's still there, like under the surface. Completing his resemblance to a man who was sitting for his portrait, Mr. Lorry dropped off to sleep. The arrival of his breakfast roused him, and he said to the drawer, as he moved his chair to it, "I wish accommodations prepared for a young lady who may come here at any time today. She may ask for Mr. Jarvis Lorry, or she may only ask for a gentleman from Tellson's Bank. Please to let me know." "Yes, sir. Tellson's Bank in London, sir?" "Yes. Yes, sir. We have oftentimes the honour to entertain your gentlemen in their travelling backwards and forwards betwixt London and Paris, sir. A vast deal of travelling, sir, in Tellson's and Company's house. Wink, wink! The bank is what connects these two cities." "Yes, we are quite a French house, as well as an English one." "Yes, sir. Not much in the habit of such travelling yourself, I think, sir?" "Not of late years. It is 15 years since I came last from France." "Oh, awkward pronoun correction. Could that be important? I don't know." Indeed, sir. That was before my time here, sir, but before our people's time here, sir. The George was in other hands at that time, sir. I believe so. But I would hold a pretty wager, sir, that a house like Tellson's and Company was flourishing a matter of 50, not to speak of 15 years ago. You might treble that and say 150, yet not be far from the truth. Indeed, sir! Shocking! Rounding his mouth and both his eyes as he stepped backward from the table, the waiter shifted his napkin from his right arm to his left, dropped into a comfortable attitude, and stood surveying the guest while he ate and drank, as from an observatory or watchtower, according to the immemorial usage of waiters in all ages. So I know you'd probably think it was creepy if today you went out to TGI Fridays and were sitting there eating and your waiter was, 10 feet away staring at you, waiting for you to need something. But that was the way it was back then, and even in some of the much fancier restaurants it still is today. They make that little, commentary about Tellson's Bank, and the waiter's just making small talk when he realizes the guy works for Tellson's. And Laurie's like, yes, I work for Tellson's. I travel back and forth, but I haven't been traveling in 15 years. Oh, you're going to figure out why in a minute. And the guy's like, well, I bet the Tellson's was a super popular, important place, back in that day. I bet it was super popular and important even 50 years ago. And Laurie goes, well, you could triple that. So even 150 years ago, Tellson's was still operating and super important to the dealings between London and Paris. The waiter is, I guess, appropriately shocked and then goes, to stand by the wall and stare. When Mr. Lorry had finished his breakfast, he went out for a stroll on the beach. The little narrow, crooked town of Dover hid itself away from the beach and ran its head into the chalk cliffs like a marine ostrich. The beach was a desert of heaps of sand and stones tumbling wildly about, and the sea did what it liked, and what it liked was destruction. It thundered at the town and thundered at the cliffs and brought the coast down madly. The air among the houses was of so strong a piscatory flavor that one might have supposed sick fish went up to be dipped in it, as sick people went down to be dipped in the sea. A little fishing was done in the port, and a quantity of strolling about by night, and looking seaward, particularly at those times when the tide made, and was near flood. Small tradesmen, who did no business whatever, sometimes unaccountably realized large fortunes, and it was remarkable that nobody in the neighborhood could endure a lamplighter. Okay, so that's actually a hysterical description of Dover, but it's only funny if you know that Dover's a smuggling town. So, the little fishing, that's because they didn't really, do much fishing. They got all of their money and their business from smuggling. And when it talks about how nobody can stand the light, well, of course you can't stand the light. All of your business is supposed to be done secret at night. So, lamp and light would equal danger and getting busted. So they're like, oh, no light. And the strolling about by night, looking seaward, that's to see if, your ship with all your smuggled goods is coming in. It only happens around flood time. I mean, all of that is just, a sneaky way of describing this town that's famous for smuggling. Oh, and there was a good simile, too, about how the Dover hid itself from the beach like a marine ostrich. Because there's, that image of an ostrich, which isn't even true, that ostriches hide their head in the sand even though the rest of their body can be seen. In fact, that image, I forgot this, that image is actually used in Carlyle's book about the French Revolution that Dickens drew heavily on when he was writing this book. I mean, that was his main source of research. So that's not an accidental comparison. As the day declined into the afternoon, and the air, which had been at intervals clear enough to allow the French coast to be seen, became again charged with mist and vapor, Mr. Lorry's thoughts seemed to cloud too. When it was dark, and he sat before the coffee-room fire, awaiting his dinner, as he had awaited his breakfast, his mind was busily digging in the live red coals. So just like in the mail coach, he's again having that dream, that pseudo-dream of digging, metaphorically, someone out of a grave. A bottle of good claret after dinner does a digger in the red coals no harm. Otherwise, then it has a tendency to throw him out of his work. Claret, if you don't know, is a wine. It's supposed to be a light wine, so not as much alcohol content as others. It was a light wine, but it was still enough to get him a little tipsy and knock him out of his work, quote-unquote work, in the daydream, the digging. Okay, enough to muddle his brain. Mr. Lorry had been idle a long time, and had just poured out his last glassful of wine, with as complete an appearance of satisfaction as is ever to be found in an elderly gentleman of a fresh complexion who has got to the end of a bottle, when a rattling of wheels came up the narrow street and rumbled into the inn-yard. He set down his glass untouched. "This is Mamselle," he said. In a very few minutes the waiter came in to announce that Miss Manette had arrived from London and would be happy to see the gentleman from Tellson's. So soon? Miss Manette had taken some refreshment on the road and required none then, and was extremely anxious to see the gentleman from Tellson's immediately, if it suited his pleasure and convenience. The gentleman from Tellson's had nothing left for it but to empty his glass with an air of stolid desperation, settle his odd little flaxen wig at the ears, and follow the waiter to Miss Manette's apartment. It was a large, dark room, furnished in a funeral manner, with black horsehair and loaded with heavy, dark tables. These had been oiled and oiled until the 2 tall candles on the table in the middle of the room were gloomily reflected on every leaf, as if they were buried in deep graves of black mahogany, and no light to speak of could be expected from them until they were dug out. So you just keep this image of death and digging and burial, and this darkness, even the room, is kind of symbolic of that. In fact, there's even going to be a point where they describe the little statues in the room, and they're missing their heads. Yeah, that's not relevant. Notice, does Mr. Lorry really want to go in and have this conversation? Not so much. I mean, he has to prepare himself like he's going into battle. He picks up that glass of wine that he just poured, so a full glass of reasonably strong wine for our standards, and chugs it. He just knocks it all back. And then he settles his wig on his head like a soldier would, straighten his helmet, and goes into battle. He has to, get himself pumped up for this conversation. The obscurity was so difficult to penetrate that Mr. Lorry, picking his way over the well-worn Turkey carpet, supposed Miss Manette to be, for the moment, in some adjacent room, until having got past the 2 tall candles he saw standing to receive him by the table between them and the fire, a young lady of not more than 17, in a riding cloak, and still holding her straw travelling hat by its ribbon in her hand. As his eyes rested on a short, slight, pretty figure, a quantity of golden hair, a pair of blue eyes that met his own with an inquiring look, and a forehead with a singular capacity, remembering how young and smooth it was, of lifting and knitting itself into an expression that was not quite one of perplexity or wonder or alarm, or merely of a bright fixed attention, though it included all the 4 expressions. As his eyes rested on these things, a sudden vivid likeness passed before him, of a child whom he had held in his arms on the passage across that very channel, one cold time, when the hail drifted heavily and the sea ran high. When was the last time Mr. Lorry was in France? 15 years ago? How old is Miss Manette that he's meeting right now? 17. He has a brief flashback of a child he held in his arms. Okay. If you can't put 2 and 2 together by this point, there's no hope for you. The likeness passed away, like a breath along the surface of the gaunt pier glass behind her, on the frame of which a hospital procession of Negro cupids, several headless and all cripples, were offering black baskets of Dead Sea fruit to black divinities of the feminine gender, and he made his formal bow to Miss Manette. "Pray, take a seat, sir," in a very clear and pleasant young voice, a little foreign in its accent, but a very little indeed. "Yeah, that would happen if you moved to another country when you were 2, I think." "I kiss your hand, miss," said Mr. Lorry, with the manners of an earlier date, as he made his formal bow again and took his seat. So, that was kind of the fashion way, way back when you were introduced to, a fashionable young lady or something like that, you would take her hand, put a little kiss on it, and it was respectable. I'm sure some people took advantage of that and were a little licentious with their kisses, but not Mr. Lorry. It's very formal, it's very respectful. He kisses her hand, makes that bow, and then stands back up. "I received a letter from the bank, sir, yesterday, informing me that some intelligence or discovery The word is not material, miss. Either word will do.
Respecting the small property of my poor father, whom I never saw, so long dead.
Mr. Lorry moved in his chair and cast a troubled look toward the hospital procession of Negro Cupids, as if they had any help for anybody in their absurd basket. I mean, this thing is so comical. He is so awkwardly uncomfortable. She mentioned her dad, who's been dead so long. And then Mr. Lorry starts like shuffling in his chair and looking like completely uncomfortable, even looking to the statues on the wall for help, as if like they could carry this conversation instead of him.
Render it necessary that I should go to Paris? There to communicate with the gentleman of the bank, so good as to be dispatched to Paris for the purpose.
Myself.
As I was prepared to hear, sir.
She curtsied to him. Young ladies made curtsies in those days. With a pretty desire to convey to him that she felt how much older and wiser he was than she. Oh my god. Okay, there are parts of this book that literally make me want to vomit, and this is one of them. For a multitude of reasons, Lucy annoys the fire out of me. She is this pretty, perfect, beautiful little golden doll. She's so sweet. She is like Dickens' dream girl. You know how he kind of wanted that little subservient miss? This is her. So clearly, Mr. Lorry is so much older and wiser. I'll just listen to everything he says. Okay, accept it, embrace it, move on. She's this beautiful little heroine. She is the princess of the story, so just accept it. Don't let it annoy you like it does me.
I replied to the bank, sir, that as it was considered necessary, by those who know, and who are so kind as to advise me, that I should go to France, and that as I am an orphan, and have no friend who could go with me, I should esteem it highly if I might be permitted to place myself during the journey under that worthy gentleman's protection. The gentleman had left London, but I think a messenger was sent after him to beg the favor of his waiting for me here.
I was happy, said Mr. Lorry, to be entrusted with the charge. I shall be more happy to execute it.
Sir, I thank you indeed. I thank you very gratefully. It was told me by the bank that the gentleman would explain to me the details of the business, and that I must prepare myself to find them of a surprising nature. I have done my best to prepare myself, and I naturally have a strong and eager interest to know what they are.
Naturally, said Mr. Lorry. Yes, After a pause, he added, again settling the crisp flaxen wig at the ears, it is very difficult to begin. He did not begin, but in his indecision met her glance. The young forehead lifted itself into that singular expression. But it was pretty and characteristic, besides being singular, and she raised her hand, as if with an involuntary action she caught at, or stayed some passing shadow.
Are you quite a stranger to me, sir?
Am I not? Mr. Lorry opened his hands and extended them outwards with an argumentative smile. So, he's been sent by the bank to go to Paris and wait for her there to help her with whatever this thing is. Whenever they being Tellson's, sends Miss Manet word that she's to go to Paris, she responds with, well, I'm an orphan and I don't have anyone who could travel with me, so if this banker's going from London to Paris anyway, would it be okay if I traveled with him under his protection? Because it was definitely not safe for a young lady, or any lady, honestly, to travel alone back then. That was like serious faux pas. So, of course, they said, yes, we'll have him wait for you. That was the whole message Jerry sent, the wait for Mademoiselle at Dover. Got it. But this other little thing going on right now, this seems a little unexpected. She seems to recognize him. She holds out her hand like, wait, don't I know you? And instead of answering the question, he questions her back. He's like, am I not? Am I not a total stranger? Between the eyebrows and just over the little feminine nose, the line of which was as delicate and fine as it was possible to be, the expression deepened itself as she took her seat thoughtfully in the chair by which she had hitherto remained standing. He watched her as she mused, and the moment she raised her eyes again went on.
In your adopted country, I presume, I cannot do better than address you as a young English lady, Miss Manette. If you please, sir.
Miss Manette, I am a man of business. I have a business charge to acquit myself of. In your reception of it, do not heed me any more than if I was a speaking machine. Truly, I am not much else. I will, with your leave, relate to you, miss, the story of one of our customers.
Story? He seemed willfully to mistake the words she had repeated, when he added, in a hurry, yes, customers. In the banking business, we usually call our connection our customers. He was a French gentleman, a scientific gentleman, a man of great achievements, a doctor. Not of Beauvais? Why, yes, of Beauvais, like Monsieur Manette, your father. The gentleman was of Beauvais. Like Monsieur Manette, your father, the gentleman was of repute in Paris. I had the honor of knowing him there. Our relations were business relations, but confidential. I was at that time in our French house, and had been, 20 years. At that time? I may ask, at what time, sir? I speak, miss, of 20 years ago. He married an English lady, and I was one of the trustees. His affairs, like the affairs of many other French gentlemen and French families, were entirely in Tellson's hands. In a similar way, I am, or have been, trustee of one kind or another for scores of our customers. These are mere business relations, miss. There is no friendship in them, no particular interest, nothing like sentiment. I have passed from one to another in the course of my business life, just as I pass from one of our customers to another in the course of my business day. In short, I have no feelings. I am a mere machine. To go on. But this is my father's story, sir, and I begin to think. The curiously roughened forehead was very intent upon him. That when I was left an orphan through my mother's surviving my father only 2 years, it was you who brought me to England. I am almost sure it was you. Mr. Lorry took the hesitating little hand that confidingly advanced to take his, and he put it with some ceremony to his lips. He then conducted the young lady straightway to her chair again, and, holding the chair back with his left hand, and using his right by turns to rub his chin, pulled his wig at the ears, or point what he said, stood looking down into her face while she sat looking up into his. Okay, this whole time he's like, I'm a machine, I have no emotion, which is so obviously a lie. I mean, he's not even saying it without emotion, which I know I'm not doing a good job of acting. But the guy's totally nervous. He's completely emotional. So he's saying one thing and trying to dehumanize himself by calling himself a machine, but he's totally invested in this story. This whole, we're not friends. Clearly he's made some kind of attachment. Miss Manette, it was I. And you will see how truly I spoke of myself just now in saying I had no feelings, and that all the relations I hold with my fellow creatures are mere business relations. When you reflect that I have never seen you since. No, you have been the ward of Tellson's house since, and I have been busy with other business of Tellson's house since. Feelings. I have no time for them, no chance of them. I pass my whole life, miss, in turning an immense pecuniary mangle. Pecuniary, for those of you who don't know, is like a monetary, so basically he's referring to the bank. He's like, my life is the bank. I work for the bank. I do business of the bank, and that is all my life is. After this odd description of his daily routine of employment, Mr. Lorry flattened his flaxen wig upon his head with both hands, which was most unnecessary, for nothing could be flatter than its shining surface was before, and resumed his former attitude. So far, miss, as you have remarked, this is the story of your regretted father. Now comes the difference. If your father had not died when he did, don't be frightened. How you start. She did indeed start, and she caught his wrist with both her hands, because she's not a total idiot. She's realized this is the story of her father, and now he makes an awkward segue of, well, if your dad hadn't died when he did. And she's like, wait, he's not dead? Pray, said Mr. Lorry in a soothing tone, bringing his left hand from the back of the chair to lay it on the supplicatory fingers that clasped him in so violent a tremble. "Pray, control your agitation. A matter of business, as I was saying." Her look so discomposed him that he stopped, wandered, and began anew. "As I was saying, if Monsieur Manette had not died, if he had suddenly and silently disappeared, if he had been spirited away, if it had not been difficult to guess to what dreadful place, though no art could trace him, if he had an enemy in some compatriot who could exercise a privilege that I in my own time have known the boldest people afraid to speak of in a whisper across the water there. For instance, the privilege of filling up blank forms for the consignment of anyone to the oblivion of a prison for any length of time. If his wife had implored the king, the queen, the court, the clergy of any tidings of him, and all quite in vain, then the history of your father would have been the history of this unfortunate gentleman, the Doctor of Beauvais." Okay, so he's doing this whole as if we don't already know he's telling the story of Dr. Manette. But if he hadn't really died, if he had just disappeared, as people are occasioned to do, if somehow he had an enemy high up that even the boldest people, if he had okay, so I'll be the leading and revising this as well too. If he had an enemy high up who committed an act so atrocious, even like high up people are afraid to speak of it, to even utter that it could happen. If perhaps that high up person had forged documents and put him in prison under a different name, or no name at all. If he had just been locked up away instead of killed, instead of died. If the wife of this sad doctor had begged everyone all the way up to the king for help to no avail, then that would be the story of Lucy's father. And it is. That's what happened to him. "I entreat you to tell me more, sir." "I will. I'm going to. You can bear it." "I can bear anything but the uncertainty you leave me in at this moment." "You speak collectedly, and you are collected. That's good." Though his manner was less satisfied than his words. "Matter of business. Regard it as a matter of business that must be done. Now, if this doctor's wife, though a lady of great courage and spirit, had suffered so intensely from this cause before her little child was born—" "The little child was a daughter, sir?" "A daughter. A matter of business. Don't be distressed, miss. If the poor lady had suffered so intensely before her little child was born, that she came to the determination of sparing the poor child the inheritance of any part of the agony she had known the pains of, by rearing her in the belief that her father was dead—" "No, don't kneel. In heaven's name, why should you kneel to me?" "For the truth. Oh, dear, good, compassionate sir, for the truth." A matter of business. You confuse me. And how can I transact business if I am confused? Let us be clear-headed. If you could kindly mention now, for instance, what 9 times 9 pence are, how many shillings and 20 guineas, it would be so encouraging. I should be so much more at ease about your state of mind." Okay, so Lucy is appropriately, I think, freaking out. Coming to the realization that she's not an orphan anymore, but that her father is alive and she's about to get to go see him. I think that deserves a little bit of emotion. And so she's showing emotion, and Mr. Lorry is totally freaked out by it. I mean, he can't handle it. He's like moving his wig. He's having to repeat business to help him like totally break down. Whenever she looks like she's really distraught, he's like, instead of "how many fingers am I holding up?" he asks her, "What's 9 times 9 pence?" Right? Because he's a banker, and he's like, "Do math in your head. If you could do math, then you must be completely okay." And I can go on. It's like, and this scene is so ridiculously funny. Without directly answering to this appeal, she sat so still when he had gently raised her. The hands that had not ceased to clasp his wrists were so much more steady than they had been, that she communicated some reassurance to Mr. Jarvis Lorry. That's right. Courage! Business!
You have business before you, useful business. Miss Manette, your mother took this course with you, and when she died, I believed broken-hearted, having never slackened in her unavailing search for your father. She left you, at 2 years old, to grow up to be blooming, beautiful, and happy, without the dark cloud upon you of living in uncertainty whether your father soon wore his heart out in prison, or wasted there through many lingering years. As he said the words, he looked down, with admiring pity, on the flowing golden hair, as if he pictured to himself that it might have been already tinged with gray. So he's worried like the shock would have caused her to go gray. So Lucy's mom, in an effort to save her young child of the heartbreak she herself felt, lied and raised her daughter, saying, "Your father's dead." Even though she's been searching for 2 years for him. And Laurie feels reasonably confident that this search for 2 years is what killed her, that she died broken-hearted, knowing her husband was out there somewhere, but never being able to find him. You know that your parents had no great possession, and that what they had was secured to your mother and to you. There has been no new discovery of money, or of any other property, but, giant dash, what's the only other thing left to discover if it's not money? What could it be? He felt his wrist held closer, and he stopped. The expression in the forehead, which had so particularly attracted his notice, and which was now immovable, had deepened into one of pain and horror. But he has been found. He is alive. Greatly changed, it is too probable. Almost a wreck, it is possible. Though we will hope the best. Still alive, your father has been taken to the house of an old servant in Paris, and we are going there. I, to identify him if I can. You, to restore him to life. Love, duty, rest, comfort. And now we know the meaning of the title of the whole book, the first, Recalled to Life. Dr. Manette has been found. He's been rescued from whatever prison, and you'll find that one out soon enough, he's been kept in. He's being kept in the house of an old servant. And it's important to remember this servant connection because the servant is a really important character in the book. Laurie's going to identify him because he's the only one around who would remember him, what he looked like. And Lucy is going to recall him to life because being locked in prison for 15 years is enough to change anyone. And Laurie is worried, if you look at the way he describes him, he's worried that he's going to be greatly changed, almost a wreck, like almost unsalvageable. A shiver ran through her frame, and from it through his. She said in a low, distinct, awe-stricken voice, as if she were saying it in a dream, "I'm going to see his ghost. It will be his ghost, not him." Mr. Laurie quietly chafed the hands that held his arm. So chafed, like her hands are like gripping him so hard they're cold, so he's rubbing them like this, rub, 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 rub. There, see now. The best and the worst are known to you now. You are well on your way to the poor wronged gentleman, and, with a fair sea voyage and a fair land journey, you will be soon at his dear side. She repeated in the same tone, sunk to a whisper, "I have been free. I have been happy, yet his ghost has never haunted me." "Only one thing more," said Mr. Laurie, laying stress upon it as a wholesome means of enforcing her intention. "He has been found under another name. His own, long forgotten or long concealed. It would be worse than useless now to inquire which, worse than useless to seek to know whether he has been for years overlooked or always designedly held prisoner. It would be worse than useless now to make any inquiries, because it would be dangerous. Better not to mention the subject anywhere or in any way, and to remove him, for a while at all events, out of France. Even I, safe as an Englishman, and even Tellson's, important as they are to the French credit, avoid all naming of the matter. I carry about me not a scrap of writing openly referring to it.
This is a secret service altogether. My credentials, entries, and memoranda are all comprehended in the one line, recalled to life, which may mean anything. But what is the matter? She does not notice a word. Miss Monet! Perfectly silent and still, and not even fallen back in her chair, she sat under his hand, utterly insensible, with her eyes open and fixed upon him, and with the last expression looking as if it were carved or branded into her forehead. So close was her own hold upon his arm that he feared to detach himself lest he should hurt her. Therefore he called out loudly for assistance without moving. So he cautions her. Dr. Monet has been found under another name. Whether he was intentionally put in prison without his original name, who knows, who cares, but we can't make any inquiries about him. We can't talk about him while we're in Paris. We can't try to find out what happened to him while we're in Paris because it would be dangerous. Whatever enemy put him there in the first place could still be out there, could still be after him, and could come after us. And nothing, not me being an Englishman, not the bank itself, could protect us. So we do everything in secret. I don't carry anything on my body that says I'm going to rescue this man. The only thing I have is a message that says recalled to life, which could mean anything. No one could hold that against us. We can't talk about it. And when he finishes his little speech about the dangers, he looks at her, and it's like she fainted standing up, or sitting down, I guess I should say. She's just sitting there, eyes open, nothing going in. Totally non-responsive, and Laurie loses it. He's like, help! Help! Crying out for help. A wild-looking woman, whom, even in his agitation, Mr. Laurie observed to be all of a red color, and to have red hair, and to be dressed in some extraordinary tight-fitting fashion, and to have on her head a most wonderful bonnet, like a grenadier wooden measure, and good measure, too, or a great Stilton cheese, came running into the room in advance of the inn service, and soon settled the question of his detachment from the poor young lady by laying a brawny hand upon his chest and sending him flying back against the nearest wall. I really think this must be a man, was Mr. Laurie's breathless reflection, simultaneously with his coming against the wall. Why, look at all of you, brawled this figure, addressing the inn servants. Why don't you go and fetch things instead of standing there staring at me? I am not so much to look at, am I? Why don't you go and fetch things? I'll let you know. If you don't bring smelling salts, cold water, and vinegar quick, I will. There was an immediate dispersal for these restoratives, and she softly laid the patient on a sofa, and tended her with great skill and gentleness, calling her, my precious, like Gollum, sorry, my precious, and my bird, and spreading her golden hair aside over her shoulders with great pride and care. And you in brown, she said indignantly, turning to Mr. Laurie. Couldn't you tell her what you had to tell her without frightening her to death? Look at her, with her being pretty pale face and her cold hands. Do you call that being a banker? Mr. Laurie was so exceedingly disconcerted by a question so hard to answer that he could only look on at a distance, with much feeble sympathy and humility, while the strong woman, having banished the inn servants under the mysterious penalty of letting them know, something not mentioned if they stayed there staring, recovered her charge by a regular series of gradations, and coaxed her to lay her drooping head upon her shoulder. Okay, now you don't know her name yet, but this female caretaker, this red woman, is Miss Pross. And she's a minor character, but, I mean, everything's interconnected, so don't let any small detail you think is inessential slide, because I promise it's probably coming back later to haunt you. This is hysterical description of her, too. She's like a linebacker. Imagine, like, someone who looks like Troy Polamalu, only with red hair, running in, seeing her blue, my precious and Ladybird, pseudo-passed out, gripping Mr. Laurie. She shoves him so hard, he goes flying into the wall and detaches, Lucy's hand from him. And she's all coddling Lucy, like, oh, my precious, my Ladybird, so sweet, so gentle, right? And then, like, anyone else, she's yelling at like a tiger, like, go get smelling salts or I'll cut you, It's so funny. And Mr. Laurie's even like, that's gotta be a man. I know it looks like a woman. It's sort of dressed like a woman wearing a cheese on her head, but no, that's gotta be a guy under there.
So she kind of coaxes Lucy back to life, and Mr. Lorry looks and he goes, "I hope she will do well now," said Mr. Lorry. "No thanks to you and Brown if she does, my darling, my pretty." "I hope," said Mr. Lorry, after another pause of feeble sympathy and humility, "that you accompany Miss Manette to France." "A likely thing, too," replied the strong woman. "If it was ever intended that I should go across salt water, do you suppose Providence would have cast my lot in an island?" This being another question hard to answer, Mr. Jarvis Lorry withdrew to consider it. Okay, so that might not be funny to you, but trust me, it's really hysterical. So you have this crazy huge woman, like, bringing Lucy back to life, and Mr. Lorry's like, so I really hope you're going to go with us to Paris, because he does not want to have to deal with a young woman on his own. I mean, he's a bachelor, and he is an old man. He does not know how to deal with young ladies. So he's like, oh, please some company, please someone to help me with this. And Miss Pross, the caretaker, who apparently is terrified to go across water, because look at how she treats Lucy. Do you think there's anything that could keep her away from her pretty little ladybird? No, except a great giant fear. So she covers that up with a joke saying, if God wanted me to cross the ocean, he wouldn't have planted me on an island. And then Mr. Lorry's like, I'm just going to walk away from all the crazy, and he leaves the room. That is how Chapter 4 ends, a little funny. Yeah, the end.